Hello, my name is Jim Hadley, and as most of you probably know, this 4-lecture series is a sequel to the series of series I've been giving here for some time, and I usually start each series with an elaborate attempt to present my overall perspective on the subject and to try to persuade you it's the right one. But since I only have 4 lectures this time instead of the usual 10, I'll try to be brief with this intro. I'm giving this little speech in an art gallery instead of a symphony hall or a library because I'd be willing to argue that the visual arts are more important in 19th century Paris than literature or music, say. But in any case, we will be spending more time on them, and especially on painting. This is partly a function of the fact that music and literature are serial art forms which don't lend themselves to the kind of treatment that I can provide here, but we will hear a lot about them too. But since the visual arts will be the primary focus, I feel obliged to say a word or two especially about them. And most art historians do, in fact, spend a lot of time essentially just defining their subject. H.W. Jansen, in the famous first edition of his History of Art, spent more time trying to define art than he did talking about the actual art of Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael combined. In the latest edition of Jansen, the authors who are writing under his name just give up and say everything is art. But this can't be right. If this were so, we could just change the name of the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art to the New York Metropolitan Museum of Things. And we could have Joe down at Amco Transmission or wherever saying, "Hey Al, hand me that wrench and the other work of art in your toolbox." The fact that this kind of thing sounds really odd means, of course, that something's wrong. It may be, however, that even if it's not the case that everything is art, one can more sensibly argue that everything is potentially art. Museums like the New York Metropolitan Museum or the Legion of Honor are full of things which were not meant to be works of art. Broken crockery, the armor of Henry VIII. The Carnavalet Museum in Paris has Napoleon's toothbrush in a case right next to Gerard's famous portrait of Madame Récamier. Museums are like attics, the attics of civilization, and paintings are just among the most exalted souvenirs that the history of civilization has produced and saved in its attics. The things in your attic mean something to you because you know the context they represent. And to get what's most valuable out of the things in the attic of civilization, you need to know about the context they represent. And the purpose of these lectures, then, is to at least begin to provide some of the context, the overall historical and artistic environment in which the works of art we'll see were created. So when you see them in a museum or an attic, there'll be something more than just dramatic intersecting diagonals, monumentally grouped subjects of organic complexity or whatever. They'll be real souvenirs. Bien, mes amis, à la faire. So this is Paris from the air now. A lot of memorable things have been said about the great cities of the world. All roads lead to Rome, the eternal city. Johnson says when a man is tired of London, he's tired of life. Lamartine says if you can only glance at the world once, look at Istanbul. Oakland, there's no there, says Gertrude Stein. And speaking of Paris, someone once wrote, "Paris, what an immense word." And certainly immense in its cultural contributions. In the 19th century, Vienna had great composers, but few painters. London had great writers, but few composers. Paris had everything. Writers like Balzac, Hugo, and Zola, composers like Berlioz, Chopin, Debussy, and maybe, although this kind of thing is difficult to quantify and easy to argue about, the greatest collection of important painters ever in one city. In the visual arts, at least, the 19th century really is the French century. We can see what it actually looked like now and then thanks to the efforts of Félix Tourneschon, known as Nadar, who took the earliest aerial photographs ever, this one in 1858, and also took pictures of just about every famous person in the city in the whole 19th century, and he lived almost the entire length of it, dying at 90 in 1910. When he was born, Napoleon was alive. When he died, my father was alive, which makes all this seem more contemporary somehow. He nearly killed himself in his balloon. He was certainly lucky to live to be 90. Broke both his legs, nearly killed his wife as well. In From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne, the name Ardan is an anagram made from the letters in Nadar. You can, of course, see the Arc de Triomphe in this picture. This is the Avenue Foch now, with the arch, the Arc de Triomphe, off the screen at the right. Whether or not you want to call his photographs works of art, the portraits he made of everyone in the arts, from Delacroix to Monet, Berlioz to Bizet, Dumas to Zola, are invaluable as evocative historical documents. The Arc de Triomphe was begun in Napoleon's day, but after Waterloo and the return of the Bourbons in the person of Louis XVIII, work on it was, not surprisingly, immediately stopped. Louis XVIII eventually allowed work to be continued on it, but it wasn't finished until Louis Philippe's day. You may remember that Louis XVIII was the brother of Louis XVI, who was executed during the French Revolution, and apart from a brief return during Napoleon's residence on Elba, he lived in exile, mostly here at Hartwell, about 30 miles north of London, so he didn't suffer much. Byron once said to him, "Why would you want to leave here? It's now a high-end bed and breakfast." This is the interior. To return to France, Louis had to accept the Charter, as it was called, which on paper at least essentially installed something like the English system of government, with a king, hereditary upper house, and elected lower house, but it soon proved predictably difficult to reconcile the interests of the old France and the new. This is Jacques-Louis David's famous picture of Napoleon I in the Alps. This is like a giant recruiting poster. It's like seeing an F-15 fly over. You look up and say, I want to do that. The most politically radical as well as the most artistically important of the painters of the Revolutionary era was David, who had been a member of the Convention government and voted for the execution of Louis XVI, Louis XVIII's brother, and had then become the favorite of Napoleon himself. He was nevertheless pardoned on his return by Louis XVIII. David realized, however, that the king's pardon didn't mean that all his enemies in Paris had forgiven him, so he declined to return from his own exile in Brussels, and so Louis then appointed David's former pupil, Baron Gerard, to be peintre du roi, the king's painter. Here's Gerard's picture of Louis XVIII back on the throne then, looking, someone has said, like he's wearing the comforter off his bed. If Napoleon on horseback is an F-15, I'm afraid Louis XVIII here is more analogous to the Goodyear blimp, maybe. Gerard painted a lot of the important people of the day, even the Duke of Wellington, for heaven's sake, and he lived long enough, as we'll see, to paint Louis' successor Charles X and his successor Louis Philippe. He had himself been named to a revolutionary tribunal thanks to the influence of David, at that time his mentor and friend, but Gerard did not have David's revolutionary fervor in him and tried to avoid his responsibilities, and as you can see, it obviously wasn't that hard to go back over to the dark side when he got the chance. You may remember, if you were here last quarter, that his friendship with David is said to have ended when Monsieur Recamier preferred Gerard's famous portrait of his wife to the teacher David's. At this time, portraits were regarded as an important part of the proper subject matter which a serious artist should choose, but ever since the painters of the Napoleonic era had devoted themselves to celebrating in paint the adventures of the new Alexander, success at painting grand historical or mythological subjects was thought to be the truest measure of artistic greatness. Louis's enemies said that the Allies brought him back with the rest of their baggage, but this is Girard's picture of Henry IV entering Paris back at the end of the 16th century, and this is why Girard was hired, to make the baggage look good. No one in Paris would have had to be told that Henry IV here was playing the role of Louis, that even as Henry had been unjustly kept from his adoring people in Paris, so was it being said here, had Louis been kept from them. The effect is to give history the quality of mythology. History also eventually takes on many of the qualities of art. This is too big a claim to say much about here, but, for example, we no longer think of Julius Caesar, Richard the Lionhearted, Napoleon so much in moral terms. We are more likely to evaluate them using the same kind of language that would apply to Macbeth or Faust or D'Artagnan. The bottom line is not were they good or bad, but are they still interesting? This is a self-portrait now by Dominique Ingres, another of the many pupils of David who, like Girard, worked both for Napoleon and for the restored Bourbons. In 1801, back in Napoleon I's day, he won the Prix de Rome at the age of just 21 with his picture called Agamemnon Taking Briseis from Achilles, now universally considered to be an absolutely awful picture. After they became artistic enemies, Delacroix described Ingres' style as a complete expression of an incomplete intelligence, meaning, I think, that the execution was complete. The problem was the idea, the intelligence, which the execution represented. Be that as it may, however, the Prix de Rome did allow the winner to study art in Italy at the expense of the state. Although the real center of gravity of art had been in Paris since Louis XIV's day, it was still thought that to see the best that had been done, one had to go to the land of Michelangelo, Titian, and especially Raphael. It's worth pointing out that Ingres is probably the only painter of the 100 or so 19th century winners of the Prix de Rome whose name might be known even to the doubtlessly well-educated audience for these programs. 100 or so painters thought to be the best are now completely forgotten. What will be said in 2300 about the painters of the 20th century? I think I know, but I'm not telling. Ingres was not able to leave for Rome until 1806, by which time he had painted Napoleon enthroned here, which he arranged to have sent in his absence to the exhibition or salon, as it was called, of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, about which we'll hear more later. Expecting to hear of a triumph, he instead received word that almost no one liked it. It's interesting that a common complaint was that it looked like a Van Eyck, as though that were a bad thing. One critic said it looked like a head set on cushions. Anyway, this made him so mad he didn't return to Paris after his scholarship to study in Rome expired, and even broke off his engagement to his fiancée there. He chose instead to remain in Rome as a freelance artist for 16 more years. His fiancée never married. She said that after having been engaged to Monsieur Ingres, she could never settle for anyone else. Other pictures which he sent to Paris were greeted with similar reviews, although he did get some commissions in Italy, most famously a request to paint this odalisque from Caroline, the sister of Napoleon, who had married his mercurial general Joachim Murat, the titular king of Naples. This was painted in 1814, but Ingres never got paid for it since Murat's regime collapsed with Napoleon's downfall. When it was exhibited later, it too was harshly criticized, not for the nudity so much, but for the anatomy. She was said to look as though she were almost boneless and sort of squid-like, with an abnormally long right arm, no elbow, an impossible twist in the body. So what, I say. The actual inspiration clearly came from his teacher David's Madame Recamier, however, who is posed in a very similar way. Ingres' work can, in fact, often be traced to obvious precedents like this. Ironically, about the only important fellow artists in Paris who defended Ingres were Delacroix and the latter's teacher Narcisse Guérin. Ingres would later come to abhor Delacroix's romanticism as the opposite of his own style. Although this is painted in a way that could be described as cold and classical and was even described as Gothic, the use of an exotic subject like a Turkish harem is itself romantic and does bring to mind Delacroix's subject matter, if not his technique. Ingres lived a good part of his time in Rome in the Via Gregoriana near the Spanish Steps, a popular area with artists of all kinds in the 19th century, and it was while he was there that his main source of income was the pencil portraits, which are now among his most widely admired achievements. He did them purely as potboilers, though, and the story goes that one day a lady came to his door to ask if this were the place where the man who sketched portraits lived, and he replied indignantly, "No, madam, this is where the man who paints pictures lives." He considered portraiture to be distinctly inferior to historical subjects as material for un vrai artiste, although he was to do nearly 500 portraits over the course of his career. This is a portrait by Ingres of an Englishman named Charles Cockerell, whom he met and who was also a friend of Géricault. Cockerell was an important architect, archaeologist, and travel writer, most famous for removing the sculpture from the temple at Bassae in Greece, for which effort he has, like Lord Elgin in the case of the Parthenon, been both praised and damned. Here you see Madame Baltar and her son. David Hockney has recently decided that Ingres and just about every other painter in the history of European art used a camera obscura or some such device, which is quickly described sort of like a camera without film. It projects an image which can be traced. There is evidence of their existence going back at least to the Renaissance, but documentary evidence regarding their use is much more scarce. Here's Ingres' portrait of the Alexandre Lethière family, done in 1819. And here's Lucien Bonaparte, one of Napoleon I's brothers. We have, in fact, accounts of Ingres at work in which no mention is made of any such device. It has been reasonably argued that Hockney is just unable to believe anyone could draw as well as this without cheating somehow. Here's a portrait of Madeleine Chapelle, who was recommended to Ingres by friends he met in Rome, and he proposed to her sight unseen in a letter. She accepted, and they were married for 36 years until her death. Ingres was an intensely neurotic and highly sensitive fellow, subject to fits over criticism, so she must have been a patient woman. In 1820, Ingres, still in Italy, received a commission from the cathedral chapter in the town of Montauban, where he had been born. This resulted in a picture, which we see here, called The Vow of Louis XIII, the king asking the Virgin for a son. He spent 4 years on it and brought it with him to Paris in 1824, where it was exhibited in the Salon to wild acclaim, and he was elected to the Académie des Beaux-Arts. The popularity he achieved with this even carried over, somewhat bizarrely, to the previously condemned odalisque, which was now lithographed, and the prints of which sold as fast as they could be made. I mentioned earlier that Ingres' subjects can often be traced to obvious sources, and this picture was clearly inspired by his hero Raphael's Sistine Madonna. For the next several years, his popularity continued in Paris, and he came to be regarded as the champion of traditional style and subject matter, and classicism, or neoclassicism as it is sometimes called, in opposition to the romantic or neo-baroque style of Géricault and especially Delacroix. However, after the overthrow of the staunchly Catholic Bourbons in 1830, about which we'll hear more later, this picture, The Martyrdom of Saint Symphorien, which had been commissioned by the Cathedral of Autun in Charles X's day, was not in sync with the new, more liberal, anti-clerical attitude popular in some influential critical circles. When it was exhibited at the Salon 1834, it was heavily criticized, and Ingres indignantly went back to Rome. It was a big project, 12 feet high or so, and he had put many years of his life into it, at least on and off. The hero of the picture, Saint Symphorien in the center, was decapitated for interrupting a procession in honor of a pagan divinity. For several years then, he served as director of the French Academy in Rome, and this is one of only a few pictures he completed during that period. It was commissioned by the Duc d'Orléans, the son of Louis Philippe, by then the King of France, and it was displayed to admiring throngs in the Palais Royal, so Ingres returned once again to Paris in 1841. The subject here had been a popular one in Paris for some time. Both Ingres' teacher, David and Girodet, a favorite of the art establishment, had painted it, and it had been the subject of several literary and operatic treatments as well. The essence of the bizarre story is that Antiochus, in bed at the right with a doctor's hand on his palpitating heart, has fallen in love with his stepmother Stratonice at the left. His father, kneeling in front, is willing to kill himself so that his son can marry Stratonice and not die of love. It turns out he doesn't have to, but I won't give away the ending. This sounds like perfect material for an opera, and Etienne Méhul's treatment, one among many, is actually supposed to have inspired Ingres' picture. This is Ingres' portrait of the Duc d'Orléans now, who commissioned the picture we just saw. He was killed in a carriage accident, the Duke, a couple of weeks after this picture was finished, and this led to a big demand for copies, to the point that practically every museum in Europe owns a version listed as from the studio of or the circle of Monsieur Ingres. This is a self-portrait of Ingres at this time, at the age of 55 in 1835. It was, in fact, in the 1830s and 40s that he did the greatest number of his celebrated portraits. Well, more about Ingres in a moment, but the two greatest composers in Paris, for any length of time anyway, in the first half of the century, were Hector Berlioz and Frédéric Chopin. We'll hear about Berlioz in a bit, but this is a portrait of Chopin done in 1835 when he was 25 by his then fiancée Maria Wojcinska. Although Chopin was raised in Warsaw and didn't arrive in Paris until 1831 when he was 21, he did become a French citizen and spent most of the rest of his life there. The next year, 1836, he met the woman he would be closest to for the next 10 years, the writer whose pen name was George Sand. This is a portrait of her by Ingres' rival Delacroix. She was the great-granddaughter of the Maréchal de Saxe, the famous general of Louis XV's day, and the great-great-granddaughter of Augustus the Strong, probably the greatest art and antiques collector of the 18th century. She was married as a teenager and had 2 children by a man she didn't love, and from whom she became legally separated shortly before meeting Chopin, by which time she had also had affairs with the writers Prosper Mérimée and Alfred de Musset. Baudelaire disliked her intensely, both personally and as a writer, but Flaubert and Balzac both spoke highly of her work, and late in life she became a close friend of the former. We'll hear more about Delacroix after the break, but you can't help but notice a big difference between this portrait painting style and the style of Ingres' work, which we have seen and will see. Chopin and Sand spent the winter of 1838-39 in rented rooms in the former Carthusian monastery you see here on Mallorca. The idea was to allow the tubercular Chopin to benefit from the presumably warm, sunny climate. Unfortunately, pretty much the whole winter was damp and cold, which weather apparently inspired the so-called raindrop prelude, which Chopin wrote there and which you're hearing played on a Broadwood piano, which Chopin did own. This is alleged to be one of the rooms in which they lived there, but the piano there now was not one of Chopin's. This is another piano we owned in the Warsaw Chopin Museum. On returning to Paris, they moved in here at 39 Rue Pigalle. They eventually moved into separate quarters, however, and the publication of her novel, Lucrezia Floriani, in which Chopin felt that he was treated in an unflattering way, led to them becoming more distant, and his support for her daughter Solange and the latter's husband in a financial squabble with Sand didn't help. Chopin rarely performed in public, but he and Sand were several times guests at the home of the artist Ari Scheffer, which now houses the Musée de la Vie Romantique, and he often played here for them and the other guests. This is a view of the interior with a portrait of Sand's great-grandfather Marshall Saxe at the left. One of the places in which he did play to relatively large audiences we see here, the 17th century Hotel Lambert built by Louis Leveau, the original architect of Versailles. It had once been owned by ancestors of George Sand herself and then by Polish expatriates who were friends of Chopin. In fact, few private residences in Paris have a more interesting history of ownership. This is a pencil portrait now of Louis-François Bertin, who was to become the subject of perhaps Ingres' most widely reproduced painting. One would suppose that a portrait wouldn't require an idea in quite the same way that a great historical or religious subject would, that it would be more a matter just of execution and more suited to Ingres' temperament. But he did put an awful lot of thought into exactly how to paint Monsieur Bertin. On a number of occasions, he broke down in tears in the studio. Bertin remembers, "I would spend my time in consoling him. My dear Ingres, don't bother about me, and above all, don't torment yourself like that. You want to start my portrait over again? Take your time for it. You'll never tire me, and just as long as you want me to come, I'm at your orders." At the time of the portrait sittings, the result of which you see now, Bertin was the editor and publisher of the Journal des Débats, which was to be one of the most influential newspapers in France for a century. This is Luigi Cherubini by Ingres. Beethoven called Cherubini the greatest of his contemporaries, although his music is now all but forgotten. Several of Ingres' portraits are of composers, and we're going to see some of those and some portraits of other people as well now, while we hear the F minor Ballade No. 4 by Chopin. It has always been regarded as one of his most memorable compositions, and we'll also see where he wrote it. This is Niccolo Paganini. Franz Liszt. The Comtesse d'Agoult, Liszt's mistress, in whose home Chopin met Sand. Charles Gounod will hear some of his music in a later lecture. The The Comtesse de Haussanville, née Louise de Broglie, was the granddaughter of Madame de Staël and was herself an author of several books, including a biography of Byron. She was a very independent woman and said it was her destiny to make those who loved her suffer. This is the Princess Josephine de Broglie. She was married to the Countess's brother, Albert, 4th Duc de Broglie, and they were the grandparents of the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Louis de Broglie. Madame de Moitessier, done in 1856 when Ingres was 76. Maybe not quite as detailed as Van Eyck, but you can see why he was compared to him. Painting, he said, is 7/8 drawing. This is a detail from that picture. He abhorred visible brushwork, and you do have to practically use a magnifying glass to see any. This is George Sand's place at Nohant. From 1839 to 46, Chopin spent summers here. It's about 100 miles southwest of Paris. He wrote a lot of his most popular music, including the Ballade No. 4 in F minor, which we're hearing at this house. It was written in 1842. This is the salon there. Sand's bedroom. This is the death mask made by Sand's son-in-law, whom she hated, the sculptor Joseph Clesinger, the husband of her daughter Solange, whom she also came to hate. This is the original manuscript of the F minor Ballade. And this is Delacroix's portrait of Chopin. As I mentioned earlier, Ingres said he didn't like doing portraits and he didn't like Delacroix, but he continued to do both portraits and exotic Delacroix-like subjects, like the Turkish bath here, to his dying day, or almost. This was done when he was 82. It was bought by Napoleon III, but his wife made him give it back. He was 84 when he did this self-portrait. And these last two pictures alone, I think, are enough to put him in the octogenarian Hall of Fame, along with Bellini and Titian and Michelangelo and Clint Eastwood and Cher. I guess she must be 80 by now. Like Ingres and many of the French artists of the 19th century who gravitated to Paris, Theodore Géricault was not born there. Also, like Ingres and most of their fellow artists later in the century, Manet, Monet, Degas, Bazille, Sisley, Caillebotte, Cézanne, he was born into a family which was at least upper middle class, but Géricault was the nephew of a fellow, J.B. Kerouel, whose Chateau Le Grand Chesnay here was just a stone's throw from Versailles itself. There's a popular idea which has been called the attic fallacy, the idea that all great painters starved in attics and didn't get proper appreciation until our own enlightened age. But the careers of a lot of artists just don't fit that scenario very well. and Jericho's is one. He never had to sell his pictures at a wine, cheese, and art fair. These are the grounds of the chateau. He studied in Paris with Delacroix's future teacher, Narcisse Guérin, but he preferred spending time sketching in the Louvre, where his hot-headedness got him in trouble, and his entry pass was eventually revoked. By the time he won a gold medal from the Salon, just 21, he and his 27-year-old married aunt, Alexandrine, were probably having an affair here and at the similarly luxurious Caruel home in Paris. The gold medal which he won was for the Charging Chasseur, now in the Louvre. Rubens is almost always mentioned by those who comment on this, and the dramatic action and the horse certainly do bring him to mind. The romantic style of the early 19th century is in fact sometimes called neo-Baroque. Géricault loved horses and was to devote a lot of time to both painting them and riding them. His early death was in fact apparently caused in part by falling off of them too often. This was painted as Napoleon was invading Russia in 1812 and was well received by the government, despite the fact that it is now sometimes alleged to have been somehow implicitly critical of what it seems very obviously to be glorifying. In any case, Géricault did join Louis XVIII's army after Napoleon's exile to Elba, and even accompanied him part of the way back to Belgium following the emperor's return. Although he in effect deserted in the chaos after that, he was never punished, however, by either side. This is an engraved portrait of Géricault by his friend Alexandre Collin, which makes him look as handsome as he is always said to have been. After the success of the Chasseur, his work was less well received, and in 1816 he left for Italy, in part at least to escape the distracting relationship with his aunt, although some think it was actually she who initiated the breakup. In Rome he lived fittingly along here on the Via degli Artisti, although the exact address isn't known. At this time he met Ingres, who was still sulking about the reception of his Napoleon enthroned painted 10 years earlier. Géricault made the mistake of praising his drawings rather than his paintings, but he was, like the other romantics, in fact of an essentially different temperament. He himself never emphasized line as much as Ingres, even in his drawings, and in Italy he cared little for the usual sources of inspiration in classical mythology, and was much more impressed by Michelangelo's figures on the Sistine ceiling than by Ingres' then more popular role model, Raphael. He was also fascinated by the dramatic horse races on the Corso and planned a colossal picture of a horse race which never materialized, although on his Italian trip as well as on a later English trip he did paint many equestrian subjects. He arrived back in Paris just as the scandalous story of the wreck of the Medusa was everywhere being discussed, and also resumed his affair with his aunt, which produced an illegitimate son who was raised apart from both parents, his mother Alexandrine living the rest of her life in isolation at La Grande-Chesnaye while her husband lived in Paris. Alexandrine outlived Géricault by a half-century and died in her 90s. On July 2, 1816, the frigate Medusa, one of the most impressive ships in the French Navy, carrying 400 crew members, passengers, and soldiers, had run aground on a reef off the coast of West Africa on its way to the French colonial headquarters at Port Louis in Senegal. After unsuccessful attempts to free the ship, it was abandoned, and in the absence of enough lifeboats to carry everyone, a raft was constructed on which 150 people were to be towed by the boats in which the higher-ranking officers, passengers, and officials of the government would ride. The bottom line is that this didn't work well, and the raft, half flooded and unmanageable, was cut loose. Here's Géricault's picture as it looks in the Louvre today. By the time the survivors on the raft were rescued 13 days later, only 15 were left alive. Blame fell primarily on the captain, who was a political appointee who hadn't sailed a ship in a quarter of a century, and the case became a kind of cause célèbre, much exploited by the anti-Bourbon faction. Géricault had gone from Bonapartist in 1812 to Royalist in 1815 to mildly Republican after that, and there was probably not supposed to be any really overtly anti-Royalist message in this picture. If there was any, Louis XVIII didn't get it, or else was able to separate art from politics. On seeing it at the Salon exhibit in 1819, he's supposed to have said to Géricault, "Your shipwreck, monsieur, is not a disaster." The original title was in fact just the generic scène de naufrage, the scene of a shipwreck, with no specific reference made to the politically controversial Medusa affair, although it does seem everyone really knew what the true subject was. This is the former Beaujon Hospital. Géricault's obsession with painting this picture is well documented. He shaved his head, rarely left his studio, demanded absolute quiet, and so on. His studio was near this place, and he acquired corpses from it, which he sketched in preparation for the finished work. This gave his studio the air of a charnel house which no one but the painter himself could stand. Delacroix said that after visiting him he ran all the way home, although it seems to have been in his case the painting itself that unnerved him rather than the body parts scattered around the room. This is a preliminary version of the picture. Géricault sought out a fellow named Alexandre Correard and other survivors of the ordeal to get eyewitness accounts. In fact, Correard's written account of the wreck became a bestseller, and he's one of the central figures here and is even more prominent in the final composition. Delacroix is said to have posed for the figure lying face down with his hand at the edge of the raft. Géricault is said to have also built a model of the raft in his studio, and according to Correard, this is what it was like. It's interesting, however, that despite all the efforts he seems to have gone to make his representation accurate, in the end he paid no attention to them. 150 people might have gotten on this raft, but not on this one. And these are hardly what one would expect the ragged survivors of 2 weeks without food to look like. These fellows look like Géricault's memories of Michelangelo's idealization. Also, the day of the rescue was calm, sunny, and blistering hot. This is a closer view of it. The picture is over 20 feet wide, the figures in the foreground close to twice life size, and it immediately drew attention among the hundreds of smaller and more traditional historical glorifications, mythological fantasies, and society portraits. Although it was given a medal, no one bought it. It's not exactly the kind of picture you would have wanted in the dining room of your chateau. Some perspective can be gained by looking at Girodet's Pygmalion and Galatea, the Ken and Barbie of their day, which also won a medal and which, unlike the Medusa, was universally praised as embodying the true purposes of art to entrance us with ideal beauty and inspire us with perfection. This is another close-up of the Medusa. Géricault took the picture to London with him, where he sold tickets to its exhibition and made 20,000 francs. He's thought to have been in part motivated to do this by the abolitionist movement gaining steam there, and with which he was very much in sympathy. There are 3 Africans on the raft, and one is given the honor of signaling the rescue ship. At the time of his death, he was in fact working on a picture condemning the African slave trade. After his return to France, he was commissioned by the pioneer psychologist Etienne Georget to paint a series of pictures illustrating types of insanity, and these constitute his last important work. There was in fact considerable mental illness on his mother's side of the family, and Géricault himself was not a model of mental stability. This is his picture of a kleptomaniac. Géricault himself was suffering from TB and from the accumulated effects of his horseback riding accidents, and died in 1824 at just the age of 32. At his death, the Medusa was sold for 6,000 francs, considered a lot of money. The average yearly salary for a working person in Paris at the time was about half that. It was sold to Count Forbin, who donated it to the Louvre, where it still is. This is the tomb of Géricault. He was buried in the famous Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, with a portrait of him by Antoine Tex, who did the figures of War and Peace for the Arc de Triomphe. In the grille around the tomb, you can see behind the G's the heart with the 2 arrows piercing it, which his illegitimate son commissioned in memory of his father, Géricault, and his mother, Alexandrine Caruel, who essentially shut him out of their lives. He never married, had no children, and lived alone on an income Géricault had provided in Brittany till his death in 1882. Okay, that's where we'll take the break then.